I was 19 when my dad remarried. It wasn't unexpected. My mom had passed away years earlier, and he had been lonely ever since. But when my stepmom, Clara, entered our lives, it was as if she brought a different energy to the house. She was young, barely in her mid-30s, and carried herself with a confidence that turned heads wherever she went. I couldn't ignore how different she was from anyone I had ever known. Her laughter filled the house, and her presence seemed to demand attention. First, everything was normal. She treated me kindly, like a friend more than a stepchild, which was a relief. We didn't have the awkward stepmom-stepkid dynamic I had dreaded. Instead, she made an effort to bond with me, asking about my college classes, my interests, and even giving advice on things I wouldn't have expected her to understand. She had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room. But then there were moments that felt different. It started small, almost unnoticeable. A touch on my shoulder that lingered a second too long, or the way her eyes seemed to find mine even in a crowded room. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overthinking. She was just being friendly, wasn't she? One evening, we were sitting in the living room while my dad was out on a late-night business call. Clara was wearing a casual dress, her hair loosely tied back. She looked relaxed. We talked about trivial things, movies, music, nothing serious. Then, mid-conversation, her hand brushed against mine as she reached for the remote. It wasn't deliberate, at least not obviously so, but it sent a jolt through me. "Sorry," she said with a soft laugh, her eyes locking on mine for a split second. I nodded, brushing it off, but my heart was racing. That look, it wasn't accidental. As the days passed, I started noticing more. The way she would ask me to help her with things my dad usually handled. Fixing something around the house, carrying heavy boxes, things that brought us closer in proximity. And then there was her habit of leaning in just a little too close when we talked, her perfume lingering in the air between us. One afternoon, she asked for my help rearranging furniture in the living room. It was harmless enough, or so I thought. As we pushed the couch into place, she stumbled slightly, her hand gripping my arm for balance. "Wow, you're stronger than you look," she said with a smile that felt more personal than it should have. I laughed it off, but her words stayed with me. Was I imagining this? Or was there something unspoken happening between us? I hated myself for even thinking it. She was my stepmom, for crying out loud. But there was no denying the growing tension, subtle but undeniably there. Between us, things began to change in ways I couldn't ignore. Clara and I seemed to find ourselves alone more often, as if by coincidence. My dad was always busy with work, leaving early and coming home late. It was clear she felt neglected, though she never said it outright. Instead, she would make passing comments about how much time he spent away. "I guess work is more important than family sometimes," she said one evening. Her voice light but her eyes betraying a hint of bitterness. I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed quiet. But she didn't seem to mind, continuing as if she just needed someone to listen. She started opening up more about her life, her struggles before meeting my dad, her dreams that she had set aside. The more she talked, the more I saw her as a person, not just my stepmom. It was strange, this growing connection between us. One evening, she came into the kitchen while I was making a sandwich. She leaned against the counter, watching me with a faint smile. "You're so self-sufficient," she said, her tone almost admiring. "Your dad's lucky to have you around." I shrugged, feeling awkward under her gaze. "I just do what I can." She stepped closer, her voice softening. "Not everyone your age is so thoughtful. It's rare." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. It felt like a compliment, but there was something in the way she said it, an intimacy that felt out of place. As the weeks went on, these moments became more frequent. She would touch my arm lightly when we talked, laugh a little too long at my jokes, or find reasons to sit close to me on the couch. I told myself it was innocent, that I was imagining things. But there was a part of me that couldn't deny the tension building between us. One night we were watching a movie together while my dad was out of town. It was nothing special, just a random action film. About halfway through, she reached for the blanket we were sharing and adjusted it over both of us. Her hand brushed against mine, and neither of us moved. For a moment, the room felt impossibly still. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're so easy to talk to. I don't know what I'd do without you here." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I should say something to break the tension, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I nodded, feeling the weight of her gaze on me. It was clear now that this wasn't just in my head. Something unspoken was happening between us, something neither of us was willing to address directly. And yet, it was there, growing stronger with every passing day. The tension reached its peak one evening when the house was quiet, and it was just the two of us again. I was in the middle of scrolling through my phone when Clara walked in, carrying 2 glasses of wine. She handed one to me without asking, her eyes lingering on mine in a way that made my stomach tighten. "It's just us tonight," she said softly, settling into the chair across from me. There was something about her tone, casual on the surface, but carrying an undercurrent that I couldn't ignore. I hesitated, unsure if I should even take the glass. "I don't know if—" "Relax," she interrupted with a faint smile. "It's just wine. You're old enough, aren't you?" Her words weren't exactly provocative, but the way she said them made it feel like more than just a question. I took the glass, more out of a need to ease the awkwardness than anything else, and took a sip. We sat in silence for a moment, the air between us charged with something I couldn't name. Then she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "You know, I feel like I can be myself around you," she said, her voice low and steady. I didn't know how to respond. Her words felt too intimate, too heavy. "I'm glad you feel that way," I said awkwardly, looking away. She didn't let me escape that easily. "No, I mean it," she pressed. "You're different. You actually listen and you care. That's rare." Her eyes were locked on mine again, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had disappeared. I couldn't tell if it was the wine or the way she was looking at me, but my heart was racing. Before I could think of what to say, she reached out and placed her hand on mine. It wasn't a casual touch. There was intention behind it, a deliberate crossing of a line. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she said softly, her voice almost breaking. My mind was spinning. Every instinct I had told me to pull away, to say something that would put an end to whatever this was. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen, caught between the weight of her touch and the impossibility of the situation. Then, almost without thinking, I moved my hand slightly, brushing against hers in a way that felt deliberate. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to shatter whatever illusion of normalcy we had been clinging to. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, I thought she was going to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're different," she said again, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. It was in that moment that I realized there was no going back. The line had been crossed, and neither of us could pretend otherwise. The morning after, the weight of everything crashed down on me like a tidal wave. I couldn't shake the memory of the night before. The way her words lingered, the way I had responded, the way we had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Guilt gnawed at me, relentless and unforgiving. I avoided her, hoping to bury everything under a facade of normalcy. But deep down, I knew it wasn't possible. Clara seemed unfazed at first, going about her day as if nothing had happened. But there was something different in the way she looked at me, a silent acknowledgement that made my stomach churn every time I caught her gaze. My dad was still oblivious, busy with work as always, and that only made things worse. Every time I saw him, I felt like I was betraying him all over again. I tried to keep my distance, but Clara wouldn't let me. She found reasons to be near me, to talk to me, to make sure I remembered what had happened. "You're quiet today," she said once, her voice light but probing. "Is something on your mind?" I wanted to scream, to tell her that yes, everything was on my mind and that I couldn't keep living like this. But instead I just shook my head, muttering something about being tired. The breaking point came a few days later. My dad had gone out for the evening, and I was holed up in my room, hoping to avoid another encounter. But Clara knocked on my door anyway. "We need to talk," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. I didn't want to, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Reluctantly, I let her in. She closed the door behind her, sitting down on the edge of my bed. "What happened the other night?" she began, her voice trailing off. She looked at me, searching for something in my expression. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think that maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. But the other part of me knew better. "It wasn't just you," I admitted, my voice barely audible. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know what's happening," she said, almost to herself. I've felt so alone lately. And you've been there for me in ways your dad hasn't." Her words should have made me angry, but they didn't. Instead, they just made me feel worse. I wanted to say something to make it all go away, but no words came. Finally, she stood up, looking at me with a mixture of regret and something else I couldn't quite place. "We can't let this happen again," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. "For both our sakes." And then she was gone, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of everything we had done, and everything we hadn't.